Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we will be discussing CSS Flexbox, which is a layout system for building responsive websites. And what we mean by this is it will allow us to build websites that resize themselves based on the size of the window, creating a great user experience regardless of screen sizes. So let's get right into it and look at this example HTML file that we have here. Here inside of the body, we just have a section, and inside of that section, we have three divs: red, green, and blue. Pretty straightforward. Each one of them has a class as well as some text inside of it. And then if we go into our CSS file, we have a little bit of pre-written code. So first, the section, I've given a height of 90 VH, so 90% of the height of the viewport. And then I've given it a border of 2 pixels dotted black, which is just creating a dotted black border around the entire section. And then each of red, green, and blue have a different height as well as a background color that corresponds to their class name. The different heights are just to make it easier to tell what some of the Flexbox properties are going to be doing, and you'll see why that's helpful in a minute. And finally, in the div rule set, we are setting some generic styling to affect all three of the red, green, and blue divs. So we have a border of 5 pixels solid black, so we can see the edges of them, a padding of 0.5 rem, a font color of white, a font size of 2 rem, and we set the font weight to be bold. Okay, so now let's get into the actual Flexbox. What Flexbox is it allows us to define a Flexbox container and then Flexbox items. And a container will be whatever is surrounding the Flex items. So to create a Flexbox container, we set something to display Flex. So I'll do this on the section. And the idea here is that we create this display Flex on whatever is around the Flex items, so whatever we want to lay out. So if we look at the HTML here, because we set display Flex on the section, it now says that all three of these divs are Flex items, which essentially changes the way that all three of these divs will be laid out on the page. And it's worth noting here that this is only affecting direct children. So if one of these divs had more children, it would only be making the top level div a Flex item, whereas the nested elements are just nested inside of that Flex item. They are not Flex items themselves. So direct children of something with display Flex are Flex items, and whatever we set display Flex to is a Flex container. Okay, so now let's look at what actually happened when I set it to display Flex. All of these divs are now on one line, and they are no longer stretching the full width of the page. They're just stretching the width of their content. And this is sort of the default behavior of Flexbox. But we can go through it and go through all of the different options of how we can get different layouts with this, how we can have it stretch the full width, how we can have it not stretch the full width, and lay out in different places all over the page. So first, let's look at the direction that we are flexing in, as we say. So there's a property, flex direction, and this defaults to row. So if I save it with row, nothing's going to change. What row says is put all of the flex items horizontally in a row. However, we could change it to column, and what this now says is instead stack them vertically on top of each other. And since this is a column layout and there's only one element per row, these elements now have the space to horizontally stretch out to fill up the container. We can also do something like column reverse, and this is the same thing, but it will change the order as well as it throws everything sort of at the bottom. We can do the exact same thing with row reverse. So this will end up with everything on the far right with it in backwards order. And the way we actually refer to this is the main axis. So flex direction with row, so I'll go back to just the default value of row for a moment, is going to say that the main axis is horizontal, meaning that the main flexing that is happening is horizontal. Whereas if we change this to column, then we are saying the main axis is the vertical axis. We're flexing vertically. And then we call the other one the cross axis. So for now, let's leave this as row. And within the main axis, we can use this property justify content to say how we want the elements in the axis to be laid out. So it starts with flex start. This is the default value, so this won't do anything. And this says put everything at the beginning of the main axis. But we could change this to say flex end, and it will push everything to the right side. We could also do something like space around, and what this says is evenly space out the elements. We can also do space between, and this is very similar to space around, the difference being that it doesn't put any space around the outside elements. They get pushed all the way to the edge of the flex container. Additionally, we can combine this with different flex directions. So for example, if I said row reverse, remember this changed the order of everything, but when we hadn't specified a justify content value, everything got pushed over to the right, and maybe we don't want that. So what we can do is we can change the justify content to flex end, and since we are in row reverse, flex end is now the left side and flex start becomes the right side when we are in row reverse. And the same thing will happen with column and column reverse. So let's change this to flex direction of column, and you'll see now with flex end, all of our values end up at the bottom because the column is now the main axis. So justify content is now controlling how these elements are laid out vertically. And we said flex end, which is going to be at the bottom. We can also change this to column reverse. And now we are in reverse order, and flex end is now the start because of the fact that we are in reverse order. But with all that said, let's put this back to row. It will be a little bit easier to work with for the majority of what we want to do throughout this video. And next, we might want to change how things are aligned on the cross axis. So the main axis, again, is the direction we are flexing, and the cross axis is the other direction. And the way we can do this is with a property called align items. And align items is just like justify content, except it is for the cross axis. So for example, I could say flex end, and you'll see all of the items moved all the way down to the bottom of the flex container because we are now on the cross axis going all the way to the end. Similarly, we could do align items center, and this would go all the way to the center. You can also use justify content center. So this is a really easy way to center things. Centering in CSS can be extremely difficult sometimes, and an easy way to do it is to set display flex on the container as well as justify content center and align items center, and that will immediately center all of the direct children of that flex container, so the flex items will all be centered. And next, you might notice that there's no space between these items, and we said we wanted them all centered, but we might want some space between them, and there's a property for that as well, and that's called gap. So gap is just that, it's the space between the items, and I could say maybe 10 pixels. This will add a 10 pixel gap between all of them. Now, gap is very similar to margin. It is almost the exact same thing. The only difference really is that it's specific to Flexbox, and it is just the gap between the flex items rather than having to set it on every single flex item and which portions you need margin on. It is a little bit more automatic. So if we just want the same spacing between all of our flex items, gap is usually the easier way to go for that. And next, what I want to look at is what happens if we have more items flexing than just 3. So let's go back to our HTML and let's copy all of this and let's add some more flex items. And maybe we can add even a few more. So now we have 9 flex items, and you can see we're out of space, and we have a scroll bar on our website now, so you can scroll and see all of them, but we probably don't want this. It's overflowing from the flex container. And the way we can control this is with what we call flex wrap. So flex wrap defaults to what is no wrap, which is what we are seeing right now, which is just overflowing. But we can change this to wrap, and this will instead go to a new line when it runs out of space. We can also do wrap reverse, which works very similar to row reverse in that we still get the wrap effect, but we will get it in reverse order. So every new line that we go to will happen in backwards order. But let's go back to wrap, and you can see it is just going to a new line when it runs out of space rather than overflowing. Now it's worth showing also, there's a bit of a shorthand here, so we can specify flex direction and flex wrap with one property, and that is flex flow. And we can say row and then wrap with a space. And this is going to be the exact same thing as these 2 lines here. So I can comment that out and it's doing the exact same thing. It's just a shorter syntax, which can be nice because there are so many flex properties that we are setting sometimes. But now that we have multiple rows, we need a way to determine how close the rows are to each other. We initially used align items for this purpose, but as you can see, when we have a flex wrap, align items is just going to align items within their individual row. And if we change this from center to say flex start, we'll see everything gets pushed to the top of their rows, but it doesn't really change how the rows are aligned to each other. The way we can do this is with another property, align content, and we can say maybe center, and this will put the rows all the way in the center. We could also say maybe space between, and this will add some space between them, as well as space around. We'll add space around them, and so on and so forth. These are essentially the same values we've seen with the other Flex properties. Now that's pretty much everything there is to Flex containers. However, sometimes we need to change how a single Flex item is aligning in the group. Maybe we want just one of them to do something a little bit different than the rest. So we have some properties that we can set on the Flex items as well to control those individual items and have them do something different than the rest. So for example, let's go down to the red class. And the first property we can look at is called order. And what this says is where in the order do we want this item to be? By default, everything is just ordered in the order that it is in the DOM, but I could say maybe -1 here because the default value is 0. And when I save this, you'll see all of the red ones get pushed to the beginning because they have a value of -1, which is less than the value of everything else. So now we have red at the beginning. We could set this to +1, and red is going to end up all at the end, again, because the default value is 0. So if we go back to 0, it will be what it already was because all of the different Flex items have an order of 0, so they're just tying and reverting back to the order that they appeared in the HTML file. And next we can look at this property Flex Grow. And what Flex Grow says is if there's extra space, how much of it should this element take up? This defaults to 0, meaning that nothing will take up extra space. This is why we saw initially everything was condensed down to the size of its content. So if I set this to Flex Grow 1, we will start seeing that when there is extra space, the red elements will take up that space. So in the first line, there is no extra space for the red elements to start taking up, so they're not really changing. But on the second line, the red element had lots of extra space. There was lots of white space on that line. So Flex Grow here said, okay, I have Flex Grow 1, none of these other elements have any Flex Grow, so just let red take up all of the space. And you'll notice that this Flex Grow has no unit to it. And the reason it is like that is because these are just proportions. So if I said green was also Flex Grow 1, then what's going to happen is red and green will take up equally the extra space and blue isn't going to take up anything. But if I said maybe green was Flex Grow 2, then red's going to take up half of the extra space of how much green is taking up because of that proportion of 1 to 2. So now let's remove these Flex Grow properties for a moment. And I want to look at something very similar, and that is Flex Shrink. And Flex Shrink says whether or not this element is able to shrink, which defaults to 1, saying essentially it is able to shrink. But now let's take this green value and let's give it a width. So let's say its width is 100 VW. Now when I save, you'll see green isn't taking up 100 VW. It's just taking up the size of the parent. It's maxing at that size. However, if we change the Flex Shrink value to 0, saying that this element cannot shrink, it needs to stay its full size, we'll see it goes back to being 100 VW and it's actually overflowing from the Flex container. And finally, we also have this property Flex Basis. So I'm going to change the width to a Flex Basis. And what this is it's essentially the same thing as width when we're in a flex direction of row. But what Flex Basis says is this is how much space I want to take up in whatever the main axis direction is. So if this was changed from a flex direction of row to column, then our green elements would get 100 VW in height. But of course, if we go back to row, they go back to having this 100 VW in width. And if we change Flex Shrink back to 1, then they are going back to just filling up the entire space because that is less than their Flex Basis width. And with these properties, there's actually a shorthand we can use very similar to the Flex Flow shorthand we saw earlier. So we can just say flex, and this will be in the order of grow, shrink, and then basis. So for example, here we can say that this is going to have a flex grow of 1, a flex shrink of 0, and a flex basis of 200 pixels, for example. So now we can see these properties interacting with each other. First, we have the Flex Grow of 1, which says allow the green elements to grow if there's extra space. And then we have the flex shrink of 0 saying that they cannot shrink down to a smaller size than their flex basis of 200 pixels. And since there's more than 200 pixels of space in each of our rows, this is allowing the green element to grow beyond 200 pixels in each row. However, if we change the basis to 2000 pixels, then now it's saying I have a base size of 2000 pixels. I can grow if there's even more space than that, and I am not allowed to shrink. And because there's no room to grow, obviously, and it's not allowed to shrink, this means that the green elements will just display as 2000 pixels and will end up overflowing from our flex container. But now, if we change the flex shrink property back to 1, it's going to say this can shrink, and it's going to shrink the green elements back down to the size of the flex container. That said, let's just move this back to 200 pixels as a flex basis. That way everything fits on the screen a little bit better again. And now that's really all of the Flexbox properties that you will need to know. It's a bit of a learning curve to get used to sort of thinking in Flexbox and thinking about which elements need to be flex containers and which elements need to be flex items, and then which flex properties do we need to set to get elements to lay out exactly how we want them to. But once you do get used to it, it's a super intuitive way to lay out pages, and it's a great way to get very responsive websites because everything's just going to sort of flow and flex, and sizes will change based on how much space there is on the screen. So everything tends to just work really well. So with that, that's going to be the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.